The Last Voyage of the Demeter is one of the most intriguing ideas a major studio has had for a horror film in recent memory. Especially coming from Universal, who you would normally expect to be keen on simply putting out something for mass appeal. I would argue that the significance of Demeter is likely to go over the head of your average Joe. Some might see the poster or trailer and think this is just another throwaway vampire movie. I even spoke with someone the other day who saw this as a new original take on the property, suggesting what if Dracula were on a boat? However, seasoned horror buffs and fans of classic horror literature alike will know that this is actually an adaptation of specifically Chapter 7 of Bram Stoker's original Dracula novel. A whole movie based on just one chapter of a book? Well, it happens to be a very important chapter where Dracula stows away on the merchant ship known as the Demeter as it travels from Transylvania to London, resulting in the demise of the crew as well as the transportation of Dracula to the location of the story's climax. In F.W. Murnau's 1922 film Nosferatu, the aftermath of the segment always freaked me out, as the idea of a merchant ship simply arriving to shore and everybody is just dead and nobody has any idea why is beyond chilling. Not to mention that in the book, this chapter is told entirely by captain's logs that are dated from July 6th of 1893 to August 4th of the same year, and in these logs, all seem normal at first, but they get increasingly unsettling as crew members start to go missing, and other strange things begin to occur. However, since this is all from the captain's perspective, that allows for a series of blanks to be filled in the narrative, as far as what actually happened on that ship within that month-long period. So for that reason, the Demeter's voyage is something that could easily stand as its own story, and could be easily adapted into a standalone feature-length film for some new insight into this part of the story. Director Andre Overdahl is also a great modern auteur who clearly has an understanding of the horror genre, and when I found out he was attached to this, I had high hopes. So this begs the question, does The Last Voyage of the Demeter justify its existence and offer any new context into this famous chapter? And I would say, yes, it does. There is a lot to like here, and there are many fun Easter eggs that should appeal to die-hard Dracula fans. I would argue these people are who this movie is mainly for, while general moviegoers might not get as much out of the experience. Some may find the narrative of Demeter to be flawed, since this is a case where you know the character's fate from the very beginning. Even if you were unfamiliar with the novel, the movie is called The Last Voyage of the Demeter. I, however, would counter that argument by mentioning Titanic, a movie based on history, where you also know the unfortunate outcome of the characters going into the film itself. But since the characters and storytelling are so well done, that creates emotional investment, and even adds tragic weight to the viewing experience because you know they're going to die. In the case of Demeter, while I wouldn't call the screenplay and characters excellent by any stretch, they are both solid. The characters do have a decent amount of development, and the performances are all very strong as well. There are even moments where the characters are talking about certain things they plan to do in the future, certain promises they made to other people, that carry an appropriate dramatic weight, since you as the viewer know the stuff isn't going to happen. There's also one character's death where you really feel the poignancy behind it more so than any other character in the movie, and I wouldn't be surprised if some people even get a tad choked up at this moment. I suppose one could say that the predictability of the narrative leads to the kill segments being not so much a matter of, is this character going to die, but more so, how are they going to die? But that really just makes this more of a slasher movie. And in the case of most slashers, you always know that most, if not all the characters, are going to die. Some have even compared this movie to Alien with its confined setting and pseudo-slasher elements, so I personally feel the lack of tension due to the narrative isn't necessarily a complaint I agree with. It does unfortunately lead into my biggest issue with this film though, and that is that the kills are incredibly underwhelming simply by their own merit. A lot of them just happen out of nowhere with not much build-up, and even the ones that are built up are very plainly staged, lacking a great deal of suspense or tension. This leads to the movie overall just not being all that frightening. Surprising too, since I would say that Overdahl's scary stories to tell in the dark had way more intense moments than anything here, and that movie is definitely aimed at teens. There are even, unfortunately, a few very lame jump scares, and some of them are just random crew members sneaking up on the character we are following. It's interesting that this movie seems to be aimed more towards seasoned horror buffs, despite those being the exact type of people who generally frown on these kinds of standard jump scares. Meanwhile, less demanding moviegoers, sure, they might get a thrill or two out of these loud noises, but they might not get as much out of the narrative, begging the question of who is this movie really for? I hate to say it, but as far as the direction overall, I feel Andre Overdahl might have gotten a tad lazy this time around. Now, don't get me wrong, I think he's a great director, and I have liked films of his in the past. I'm not saying the direction here is poor, and I have even seen far lazier work from less competent filmmakers in far worse horror films than this. But outside of some cool sequences here and there, the work behind the camera here is maybe just a tad above average. Another issue I have is that the movie is very bloated. I mentioned that this was the type of story that could easily be adapted into a feature-length film, but maybe an hour and a half feature-length film rather than a 2-hour one. Because of the narrative bloat, and the fact that this movie is just not that well directed, or suspenseful, or scary, that led to many moments of the screenplay that honestly just felt dull, and my emotional investment would begin to waver. Maybe the somewhat stilted execution is not Overdahl's fault, maybe there was studio interference, or maybe he was going for a more restrained approach due to the type of film this was. I can't say for sure, because I wasn't there, but whatever happened, it just really didn't work for me. I do like, however, that Dracula in this movie is a man in a suit, rather than some CGI creation. I will always applaud the use of practical effects in any horror film, and I do think the design of the creature is very cool. Last thing I want to touch on is that there is an alternate ending that I was slightly indifferent on. It's not anything too major, and my friend who I saw the movie with actually did enjoy it, but even if I wasn't wowed by this slightly alternate ending, I appreciated the risk taken, and I think it could have gone certainly a lot worse, especially considering the fact that I was worried that they would do something even stupider with the alternate ending of this movie, something like they all live and they all actually kill Dracula or something stupid like that. Thankfully, that doesn't happen, and I won't spoil what the actual new ending is, but they do change a little minor thing, and again, I wasn't a huge fan of it, I didn't hate it either, and I respected the new change. So by the end of the day, The Last Voyage of the Demeter is a well-shot, well-acted film with a very solid story that has some good emotion behind it, but it is a tad bloated, it doesn't really have much in the way of suspense or thrills, and even if I appreciate the new angle on the story, part of me slightly wonders if this story might not just be at its most scary when we don't necessarily know what's happening. Overall, this film did not live up to my expectations, and it is now my least favorite film by director Andre Overdahl, but it's not a bad movie, and I would say overall I liked it more than I didn't. Even if I'm not over the moon about it, I still am glad that it exists, and it is kind of a shame that it's bombing at the box office because I do think the idea of the film was very interesting, and I think it's very possible that this film could develop a cult following as the years progress. That's it for me today, guys. The Last Voyage of the Demeter was directed by Andre Overdahl, and I'm gonna give this movie a 3 out of 5.
Hey guys, welcome to today's episode of The Lens of Recommendations. If you enjoyed Demeter, I also recommend checking out The Nightingale, which is another dark period piece that also stars Ashley Franciosi, has similar racial commentary, and is also a lot more poignant than you might expect on paper. Some may argue against this being a horror film, but within the first half an hour, there is a scene that ranks among the most terrifying that I've ever seen in the history of cinema, so I say a big fat nay to that. My other recommendation goes to an earlier film from the director of the one I just reviewed, The Autopsy of Jane Doe, another confined pseudo-slasher with great characters, and this one is bone-chillingly brilliant for about the first half of it. It doesn't go anywhere super interesting in my opinion with its great setup, but the journey is incredible, and the whole film is still solid. If you guys like what I do here, please consider hitting the thumbs up and subscribing, and maybe even checking out some other projects that I'm involved with, all of which will be linked below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and see you in the next video.